welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today, Chris, we're going to be going back and we're going to be talking about something a little different than what we normally talk about on this podcast. In this podcast, we're usually talking about people and events from the past. In this podcast episode, we're going to be talking about teaching history. Both Chris and I teach history, and we're going to be talking a little bit about our experiences and what we teach as we go through this episode. But we just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about history. And Chris, I think one of the reasons we decided to do an episode like this was because there is a lot in the news today about what it means to teach history.
Yeah, and I think we have to understand the role of history in our lives. Very clearly, all of us have a history. There's no mistaking that. There is a point in which we were born. There's a point in which we were young people, and then middle age, and then older. But every day is historical in some means or fashion because, Ray, once we complete today, it's history.
Yep.
It's in the books. And what we did that day, will always be. And I think that as we look at the role of history in our personal lives, we also look at the role of history in our educational lives. And there is a lot of discussion today about what should, maybe what should not be taught in our schools and how we should teach that. And that kind of got us on the idea of how do you and I approach the classroom? How do we approach historical topics? Because, off the air, we have a lot of conversations about the role of history in the classroom and how we approach it. And I think you and I, we share a very similar philosophy of history in that we just talk history. We do not try to compartmentalize it. We don't categorize it. We just talk about history, and that at the end of the day, there's always a purpose in why we study history. The old expression, we learn history so that it doesn't repeat itself. Well, the reality is that we evidently have a lot of history we don't know. And that is why we should know, so that we can make sure we're helping to make a better society.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So I think you touched on a lot of things there, Chris, and I don't even really know where to start. But I think we maybe should start just talking a little bit about our backgrounds and what we teach. So Chris, I'm going to let you take that question first. What is your background as far as history is concerned, and what type of history do you teach?
So I've always been passionate about history and studying not just about people, but about events. And I had the opportunity to receive my undergraduate in history from Campbell. And then I received a master's in divinity with focus in church history from Campbell University Divinity School. And then I did my master's in history from Liberty University with a concentration on colonial and constitutional aspects. And today, you can find me teaching government, American history, world history, just the opportunities to really just talk about all things that are history. And I have the opportunity to do that in a high school setting, and I also get to do it at the community college level.
Yeah, when you were sitting, and I knew your background obviously, but when you're sitting there describing it, it's like it so parallels my background and what I do. Now, my undergraduate degree was not in history. That's an interesting topic within itself.
It's a whole podcast.
It's a whole podcast, believe me, of mistakes you don't want to make in your life. Anybody need to learn about degrees you don't want to earn? I've got one. No, I don't want to say that, and I'm not going to say what my undergraduate degree was in now, because I'll insult a lot of people. But after getting my undergraduate degree, I did go to Liberty University, got a Master's of Arts degree in religion, focusing on church history. Left there, went to UNC Pembroke, and got a Master of Arts degree in history education. That was more of a broad-based history degree. It really didn't focus on any particular area. I took classes in American history, Latin American history, Native American history. So it was a sort of a broad-based history program. And I also have 18 graduate hours in American government. And like Chris, I teach American history and American government. Now I think, Chris, you have a little more experience teaching like world history than I do. Most of my teaching has been American history, African American history, history of the South, that kind of thing, and not so much world history, which I think is a whole, so it's a different thing, because when you talk about American history, at least you're talking to Americans. Talking about world history, it's different.
Yeah, and as we start delving into this, I think the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what is our purpose when we go into the classroom and we are preparing to discuss a topic, whether it's world history, say it's the fall of the Roman Empire, or it's the creation of the United States Constitution. What's our purpose? And our purpose is to share with individuals. And we have to recognize that you and I do not just teach young people. We teach people of all ages and from all different cultures, from different backgrounds. But our purpose, whether it is world history or it's American history, is to share about how communities are designed to run, how communities are designed to be established, and how you live in a society. I mean, that's a key component of history, is how do you live in a society, how do you handle conflict, how do you better society, and ultimately, what is the individual's role in making society a better place? That aspect of leave it better than when you came in. And so that's, I think, when we approach a topic of history, that you and we go in saying, okay, we're going to study this, and we're not just studying it to see what happened, but we're studying it to learn what happened so that we can apply it into our context of today's society.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's exactly the point I was taking from what you were saying, is that when we talk about, for example, the progressive era or monopolies or something, we're not just simply talking about it so students can learn the ABCs of those events and all of that. We're talking about it so students, yes, they need to learn the ABCs of those events and those people, but more importantly, they need to learn how to apply the lessons that history has for us in their lives today and in their future lives. How is this going to affect how they, view what they see on TV, or what they read in the newspaper, or what their friends or family are saying around the Thanksgiving table, how they view the world. I think one of the best things about history, Chris, is it teaches people, number one, to read. If you're going to do history in a good way, whether it's primary sources or secondary sources, you got to read. There's a lot of reading in history. But because of that, and because of having to think through what happened, how to apply that today, history is a wonderful tool to improve critical thinking. It's a wonderful tool to be able to think through problems, think through solutions, the long-term and short-term effects, but also think, well, how might this particular issue be viewed differently from someone with a different background than I do?
And that is so important, because the topics that we talk about are of people who are not like us.
Right.
Regardless. I mean, I was born in Virginia, but just because I was born in Virginia doesn't mean that I share the same aspects of life that George Washington or Patrick Henry shared, even though they were from Virginia also. The fact that I went to a particular university doesn't mean I share the same things as somebody else, because we all bring into our lives different values, different principles, different ideas. And so we study those people to understand how they lived back then, what their strategies were, what they were going through, so that we can kind of learn about principles and values. Doesn't mean that we readily accept them as the sacred, perfect individuals, but that we see them in the context of their society and not necessarily our society. And I think that is a key point that we as teachers, as educators, but just lovers of history need to understand is that the people that we're studying were in a different place, going through different things, and we have to look at them based on their context and not on our context. You can't look at George Washington today in the context of 21st century. You have to look at George Washington in the context of when he was living.
Yeah, and that is precisely the point of critical thinking. Being able to, I don't know if the word I want to use is empathize with someone else's situation and circumstances, but not reading our values, our judgments back onto those people, which is very easy to do. I mean, if you think about when you're in class, Chris, or when I'm in class, if we ask students, well, why did a particular person respond the way they did, or what do you think about this particular event, they will often respond based on the only thing, to be honest about them, based on the only thing they know. And they really, I think, struggle sometimes to put themselves in the 18th century or in the 19th century because they're so fixed in the current world.
And to go along with that, you mentioned literacy earlier. You and I, when we go into the classroom, when we're teaching our courses, we have the privilege that we don't use a generic textbook.
Right.
That we are very proud of the fact that we allow our students to engage in different resources, but they're primary resources. And the purpose of that is because you and I are not going into the classroom with an agenda. My agenda, and I know we keep talking about colonial, but we could talk about World War II. When we go into a classroom to discuss World War II, it is not our purpose to share with students what they must believe about World War II. Our goal is to go in and to share with them the overall themes of World War II and then allow them to dig into primary resources, to answer really tough questions. And doing that by looking at, once again, the writings, the diaries, the letters, the conversations, whatever it was, but the things that took place during that particular context, so they, critical thinking, have an informed opinion based on their knowledge and not just us telling them what to believe.
Yeah, that's so very important, because if we go into class pushing an agenda, then we've lost right there, because we're no longer teaching history, we're teaching our perspective or our agenda. And I think what's so important is for the history teacher, whether it's K through 12 or college, the history teacher to go in a classroom to teach the subject and give the students the opportunity, as you said, to make their own judgments. Hopefully, we've given them enough information through lecture, through readings, through primary sources, that they can make educated judgments.
And I think this is a good time for us to talk just from our own personal experience. But, Ray, we're hearing a lot on television today and in social media that parents are afraid to send their children into public history classes because they're afraid that their son or daughter might be indoctrinated to a particular political view, some other view on a particular thing. But Ray, I'll speak for myself. I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of colleagues in the history field, not just locally but on a state and a national level. And I don't recall, through observations and discussions and having, a lot of dialogue with fellow educators, I don't recall ever feeling that a teacher was trying to indoctrinate a student with something, that they were doing kind of what we're doing, that they were giving the overall themes, they were talking about the good, the bad, as well as the ugly, and allowing the students, through project-based learning, to develop their own understanding of those particular things. So I think it's important our listeners know that based on our experience and based on our views in the profession, that we don't see a lot of indoctrination, we see a lot of problem-based learning.
Yeah, I think that's very good. I mean, what you just said, I agree 100% with that. And I experienced the same thing in my talking with colleagues at all different levels, the high school level, college level, university level. Most of these people who teach history are not teaching history, I'm going to make socialists out of all these kids. No, most of the people who are teaching history are teaching history for the same reason we teach history and we're doing this podcast. They have a love of history. That somewhere in their past, there was a person or an experience that embedded in them a love of a particular period of history, a particular person in history, and they have decided to spend their lives learning and teaching history. And that's what's really motivating them. And yeah, when you teach history, you're going to have to talk about things that are difficult. You're going to have to talk about things that are going to make students uncomfortable, that may make us uncomfortable. But I think that's just part of teaching history. It's just teaching the full story of history.
So, Ray, maybe let's dig into that just a little bit, because history is full of difficult topics, uncomfortable. There were some horrendous things that were done in our country and in the world. There are things that we're not proud that happened, but that we must teach about. We need to educate people. So maybe help discuss, how do we approach handling difficult topics in the classroom?
Well, I think we've already mentioned one thing you avoid doing, and that is pushing your own agenda. If I approach a topic, like I said, I have taught on numerous occasions, both in the classroom and online, African American history. And, hard conversations that I've had students come to me in the semester and say, when I first walked into this room, or when I first logged into this class and saw you, I was like, not sure what to expect. But by the end of the semester, they had a better appreciation for the subject because we looked at the history. We looked at primary sources. We delved into it. We weren't afraid to avoid difficult topics. I was not avoiding things because I was afraid what people might think. Or we dealt with it all, the good and the bad, and that's what you have to do. I think so. First off, you have to avoid those coming in with a personal agenda. I think you have to let people of the time speak. We talk about slavery. I'm really big both in American history and in African American history, bringing in those slave narratives. Whether it's slave narratives that were done after the Civil War, many years after the Civil War, talking to elderly people who had been slaves, or whether it's things written by people like Oni Judge or someone like that, and learn and bringing that material to the classroom so students can get a first-hand appreciation for what it was like, and they're not just listening to me, tell them what it was like.
I remember in one of the courses that I taught where I felt that I had done a really good job is that I had two different students. I don't remember the exact topic, but it was a government class. And I remember having one student who said, wow, Mr. Carroll, after class today, I thought you were a Democrat.
Yeah.
And then I had the other student that said, hey, Mr. Carroll, after class today, I thought you were a Republican. Mm-hmm. And so what I think is really good is that shows that I presented in that case a very balanced approach to it. Yeah. And it helps to allow students to know that I'm not coming at it, from this point of view or from that point of view, but I'm going to share every point of view, and for you to make a judgment on the point of view that you accept, that you support, and base it on documentary evidence.
I had a professor in graduate school that said something. It was probably an offhand comment. If you were to ask the professor today, they may not even remember saying it. But it was a statement that made an impact on me as a teacher, as a history teacher, as a government teacher. This particular professor said that if you are a good teacher, your students never know your personal views. And I had the same experience in teaching American government. I remember in the fall of 2016, in the midst of Hillary v. Trump, students did the same thing with me. They're like, Mr. Shepard, one day I come into class and I think you're supporting Hillary Clinton. Mm-hmm. The next day I come into class, I think you're supporting Donald Trump. And they would say, who are you supporting? And I would say, I don't know.
Right.
I'm not telling you who am I supporting. And some of them got a little frustrated with me. But I think that's when you're doing it right. I think that's a sign that you're doing it right. They're learning the material. They're engaged in the material. But also they don't necessarily know where you stand. And, sometimes I will say, now this is my personal opinion on this aspect of whatever it is we're talking about. This is my personal opinion on this, but I always will divide it up between this is the material you're responsible for versus this is my particular view on something. But it's never one of those hot button issues that I will do that on. It's always just sort of not a side issue, but something that's not as controversial. So anyway, we've talked about those difficult conversations and this idea of indoctrination. Chris, that's sort of a hot button issue for me because I'm sort of like I don't know anybody who's trying to indoctrinate students. I mean, I'm sure it happens. I can't say it never happens, but like we've said, I think most people go in the classroom to teach the subject they love to teach.
Yeah, and I think one of those other areas that we need to address, you and I have heard it over and over, that very few people love history. And there are times in which we have students come into our classes and they're like,
yeah.
I don't care about names and dates and places and events. And so, maybe we should just spend a moment talking about how we try to make history engaging. And I'll speak that one way that I try to make history engaging is that I've become more problem-based or more project-based in my courses, in which that I'm not necessarily focused on Alexander the Great conquering all of this known empire, but what made Alexander great? How did he do it? Why did he do it? Was it ethical? Was it moral? Was it legal? And when you allow somebody to dig into understanding the hows and the whys and the ramifications that come because he conquered the known world, then you start asking the question, oh my gosh, was he really great? Mr. Carroll, I've been told Alexander the Great. But when you start studying, then you make the determination. The student decides if he was great or if he wasn't great. And that's where the debate comes in. That's where the discussion, and that's where a student says, I get it. I understand now why history is important, because I didn't know how Alexander became Alexander the Great. But I should have known, because now I can have an informed opinion as to whether he is great or he isn't great.
Yeah, that project-based learning, that I guess you could say research-based learning maybe, is so important. Another thing I like to do, well, two things, and they sort of go together, is a narrative form of teaching. When I was in junior high school, and I probably shouldn't have said that, but when I was in junior high school, I had a history teacher whose idea of teaching history was writing questions on the board every day. And we just sat there and answered questions all day. That's not teaching history, in my opinion. We want to tell the story of history. And I think one thing that does, in my experience, engage students is the story.
Oh, yes.
It's the story, not just the names and dates, but the story about those names and dates. And then also giving students a stake in it. And I think you mentioned this. They have a personal reason to want to learn more about Alexander the Great, or want to learn more about Alexander Hamilton. They have a personal drive at that point to want to learn more. One thing I've seen some people have success with, and I'm actually thinking about adopting it myself, is blogs. Having students create a blog or something like a podcast maybe. So where they're doing projects that they may be interested in doing on something they're interested in doing it on, and it forces them to research it more themselves.
What made the Broadway show Alexander Hamilton so successful? It was a story. That's what it tells the story. Then you have the opportunity, because I know we can come from different points on Hamilton, but what happens is I now have a student who is engaged in learning something about Alexander Hamilton.
Right.
I then have the opportunity to take that song, to take that event that they saw on Disney Plus or they saw on Broadway or wherever it might be. I then can take that into the classroom and say, okay, factual, not factual, what's the context, how did it work, what's your opinion about it? And all of a sudden, I've taken pop culture and history, I've put it together, and the students are engaged in it.
When Hamilton first came out, I had a very suspicious approach toward it. And that's just my nature. I'm just by nature, I think, a little bit of a suspicious person. But I will tell you, I've had student after student after student, mostly young students. They know more about Alexander Hamilton than I've ever seen students know.
Yes.
Granted, there's some Hollywood thrown in there, and you have to sort of help them sift through that a little bit. But what they know about Alexander Hamilton, they know more about Alexander Hamilton than I did when I graduated college. I mean, they know a lot of stuff that, maybe kids a few years ago did not know. So things like Hamilton and the John Adams miniseries, these things are great. They're great teaching tools. And that's one thing I did want to bring in here, Chris, was teaching tools.
Yes.
And something like Hamilton, something like John Adams, or even, maybe not so much for young kids today, 1776. These videos, these films, in clips, in small portions, can do a lot to connect the students and help them maybe get a better understanding of what life might have been at the time.
And we've also been using, through COVID and other resources, doing virtual field trips.
Yes.
And being able to use the technology that is available to us to take the students to the room where it happened, if I throw that Hamilton reference in there, where they can actually see where these things occurred. Because some of our students might never have the opportunity to go to Philadelphia. They might not go to Rome or anywhere like that. But if we can bring those places to them through the virtual means that are necessary, I think that helps. Also, using the references that are out there from the pop culture. You mentioned some of those things. It does nothing but just drive interest in finding out more and more. And Ray, if there's one thing that we need to do, we need to promote every individual to becoming an educated civic citizen in which they know their rights. Don't just let somebody tell you what your right is, but understand your right. Understand how your state was formed. Understand why this particular law came into being. Understand what freedoms you have. Those are freedoms that were worked hard to achieve, but know why you have those freedoms. And that just comes from studying history.
Yeah, and I think, Chris, that's a perfect place to land the plane, so to speak. I enjoyed this conversation.
Oh, yes.
I certainly hope our listeners did. Hey, maybe this is something we can do again in the future. We can pick up at this particular point about, teaching history. Maybe we could talk about learning history one day. Just go from a totally different perspective. What worked for us, what didn't work for us.
Or we can just do a podcast on your undergraduate degree.
Yeah, we can talk about that, and I can get myself in all sorts of trouble there. Between my junior high teacher and my undergraduate degree,
There you go.
I could just offend all sorts of people, which I do quite easily. I hope everybody's enjoyed this episode. We've certainly enjoyed the conversation. Share this episode. Share it with your friends. We're available on Sounder FM, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher. We're also on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter. We're working on some YouTube stuff. So I just hope everybody share these episodes with your friends and your family. And I think this podcast is a wonderful way to introduce people to historical topics and individuals. So until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
We'll talk to you later.